will now begin the 8th lecture on 1 Samuel. We will begin with 1 Samuel chapter 18. The title is Saul Attempts to Kill David. Let's look at the main points. First, Jonathan loves David, verses 1 through 3. Second, David is given a high rank in the army, verses 4 through 5. Third, Saul attempts to kill David, verses 6 through 19. Fourth, Saul gives his daughter Michal to David as his wife, verses 20 through 24. Verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. In chapter 17, David defeated the great Goliath. Jonathan saw this and loved David. The Israelites could not defeat Goliath and were terrified. David was a young boy, but he defeated Goliath by relying on the power of God. Jonathan thought that David did what he could not do. If it wasn't for David, the Israelites would have lost in this battle. However, David defeated Goliath, and Jonathan considered David an important person. Jonathan loved David as himself. Verse 4. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Jonathan wanted to give all he had to David. Jonathan gave his robe, sword, and his bow to David. Jonathan gave his duties and position to David. Jonathan was in line to succeed King Saul as king. Jonathan was next after King Saul. Yet Jonathan gave it to David. Jonathan was next in line as king. If his father Saul died, Jonathan would become king. However, Jonathan thought that it would be better for David to become king than for him to become king. Jonathan handed over his rights for God's kingdom and glory. Jonathan gave his duties, position, and authority to David. We too must put aside our selfishness and have faith that focuses on the church. Verse 5. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. David acted wisely wherever he went and with whatever he did. David acted with faith and always gained victory in battle. Hence, Israel became rich and powerful. Verses 6 through 7. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs, and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." When David returned from victory in battle, the Israelite women welcomed him with singing and dancing. What did the women say? "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The women should not have said this. They lifted up men. Saul was king at the time, yet the woman lifted up David more than King Saul. This made Saul anxious. King Saul thought that his kingship was unsafe. Saul became jealous of David and tried to kill him. The women were rash and wrong in singing in this way. Even if David had done well, the women should have praised King Saul more than David. We must act according to order. Verse 10. The next day an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand. Saul was becoming more ruined and tormented by the evil spirit. David was playing the harp as he usually did. Saul then hurled his sword twice and tried to kill David. Saul did not act with faith. Saul should have known that it was by God's grace that he was made king. His kingship was in God's hands and was wholly under God's sovereignty. If it was God's plan that David become king, no one could stop it. God would protect David no matter how many times Saul tried to kill David. Saul did not think about God's will, but was busy trying to keep his throne. Verse 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. The Lord left Saul and was with David. David always acted with faith. God protected David so that David would become king. However, Saul wanted to take David as his son-in-law and to use it to his advantage to kill David. In verse 17, Saul first tried to give his eldest daughter Merab to David. Later, Saul gave Merab to someone else. Verse 20. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. Saul then wanted to give his daughter Michal to David. In verse 25, Saul told David that he would have to bring 100 Philistine foreskins for the price of the bride. Hence, David brought 200 Philistine foreskins so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Verse 27. David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. Saul said this so that David would fight against the Philistines. Saul hoped that David would die in the hands of the Philistines. However, David courageously went and killed 200 Philistines and brought their foreskins. Saul could not kill David no matter how hard he tried. We humans cannot stop God's works. We must not persecute believers. We must help and work with the small ones of faith. Verse 28. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, verse 29, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. Saul's daughter Michal loved David with all her heart. Saul planned to use his daughter to kill David. However, his daughter sided with David. Hence, Saul became more and more afraid of David. In this way, man's humanistic plans will ultimately be in vain. We will continue with chapter 19. The title is David Runs Away. Let's look at the main points. First, Jonathan helps David, verses 1 through 7. Second, Saul tries to kill David, verses 8 through 10. Third, Michal helps David run away, verses 11 through 17. Fourth, David goes to Samuel, verses 18 through 19. Fifth, Saul and his men prophesy, verses 20 through 24. Read verses 1 through 2. Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David, but Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, "My father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there." Saul commanded his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. However, Jonathan was very fond of David. In verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David before his father Saul and said, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David." David did nothing wrong. David laid down his life and fought with Goliath and won. David was a person of merit who saved Israel. Jonathan spoke well of David before his father. However, Saul continued to try to kill David. Verse 8. Once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. David fought the Philistines and always won. Saul tried to kill David with his spear. David then ran away from Saul. The devil tried to use King Saul to kill David. The devil worked to try to kill David and destroy Israel. Saul became a slave to the devil. We must throw away greed and arrogance. We must not be deceived by the devil. We must protect ourselves. Jude chapter 1 verse 21, 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 8 and 9. Verse 11. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, "If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed." David's wife Michal knew that her father was trying to kill David. Thus Michal helped David escape. God opened a way of escape through Michal. Verse 13. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. Michal helped her husband run away. She took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. Saul tried again to kill David. Yet when he got to the bed, David was not there, but there was an idol with goat's hair. Verse 17. Saul said to Michal, "Why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped?" Michal told him, "He said to me, 'Let me get away. Why should I kill you?'" Saul said to his daughter Michal, "Why did you deceive me?" Michal answered, "He said to me, 'Let me get away.'" In this way, God opened a road of escape for David. Verse 18. When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. David fled and went to Samuel. David received protection there and stayed there for a while. Verse 20. So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul sent his men to capture David, and he sent them to Samuel, who was with a group of prophets. Then Saul's men were moved by the Spirit of God. The men began to prophesy. Saul sent his men 3 times, but they were all moved by the Holy Spirit and began to prophesy. Saul then went before Samuel. Saul too began to prophesy. What happened? He was moved by the Holy Spirit. Saul and his men were moved by the Holy Spirit. They received God's grace. They were filled with the Holy Spirit and were filled with grace. Saul too rejoiced in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and prophesied before Samuel. In the same way, when we go near a group of people with faith, we too can receive grace. If we go near wicked people, we too will become wicked. When we go near servants who have faith, we will become people with faith. We must go near to God and receive spiritual grace. What is prophecy in the Bible? The Bible is the prophecy. Revelation chapter 1 verse 3. We must not let the inspiration of the Holy Spirit cease. We must not let the prophecy cease. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verses 19 and 20. If King Saul continued to receive the grace that he received then, he would not have become a wicked person. Therefore, we believers must always live in the midst of the grace of the Holy Spirit. Then we will be able to defeat sin and wickedness. We will continue with 1 Samuel chapter 20. The title is David and Jonathan. Let's look at the main points. First, David asks Jonathan to find out how Saul feels, verses 1 through 11. Second, Jonathan and David make a covenant, verses 12 through 16. Third, David and Jonathan make a signal, verses 17 through 23. Fourth, Jonathan finds out that Saul intends to kill David, verses 24 through 34. Fifth, Jonathan and David part ways, verses 35 through 42. Read verses 1 through 2. Then David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to take my life?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without confiding in me. Why would he hide this from me? It is not so." David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan. David wanted to find out how Saul felt. David wanted to know whether or not Saul wanted to kill him. Jonathan met David and comforted him. Verse 4. Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you want me to do, I'll do for you." Jonathan truly helped David when David was in trouble. Jonathan was willing to make whatever sacrifices he could to save David's life. A true friend helps his friend in times of need. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 24. Jonathan did his best so that his father wouldn't kill David. Verse 5. So David said, "Look, tomorrow is the new moon festival, and I am supposed to dine with the king. But let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow." The men normally dined with the king on the first day of the month. King Saul sat and ate with many people, but David's seat was empty. King Saul asked Jonathan, "Why hasn't David come?" Jonathan defended David. Verse 6. If your father misses me at all, tell him, "David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole clan." Jonathan said, "David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem." Saul then flared up in anger. Verse 12. Then Jonathan said to David, "By the Lord, the God of Israel, I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed toward you, will I not send you word and let you know?" Jonathan told David that he would sound out his father and send him word. Verse 16. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, May the Lord call David's enemies to account. Jonathan and David made a covenant with each other. Verse 17. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him. Jonathan did whatever he could to protect David. Verse 18. Then Jonathan said to David, Tomorrow is the new moon festival. You will be missed because your seat will be empty. Jonathan said, Tomorrow is the new moon festival. You will be missed because your seat will be empty. Jonathan said that he would find out what his father would say. They decided that Jonathan would then shoot arrows to the place David was at. Jonathan shot 3 arrows. He told his servant, The arrows are beyond you. When David saw this, he was to run away. If King Saul planned to kill David, Jonathan would shoot the arrows past the boy. If Saul did not intend to kill David, Jonathan would shoot the arrows on one side of the boy. What was this signal? It was a sign for David to return. They decided to use these signals. Verses 24 through 25. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon festival came, the king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place by the wall, opposite Jonathan, and Abner sat next to Saul, but David's place was empty. When the new moon festival came, David's seat was empty. In verse 27, it says that David's seat was empty again on the 2nd day. King Saul asked Jonathan about David. Jonathan replied, David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem. Verse 30. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? Saul became angry. In verse 31, he said, As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Then Saul threw his spear to kill Jonathan. Then Jonathan understood. He realized that his father had continuously intended to kill David. This was heartbreaking. Verse 35. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him. Verse 36. And he said to the boy, Run and find the arrows I shoot. As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David, and he had a small boy with him. Jonathan shot his arrows. he shot an arrow beyond the boy. Then Jonathan said, "Isn't the arrow beyond you? Hurry, go quickly." Jonathan gave the signal. Then Jonathan sent the boy away. Then David and Jonathan met. Verse 41. After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. David wept. Jonathan was also heartbroken. Jonathan had no choice but to send David away. This was a great loss to Israel. It would have been great for Jonathan and David to build up Israel together, but Saul continued to try to kill David. Hence, Jonathan had no choice but to send David away. David had no choice but to run away. We will continue with 1 Samuel chapter 21. The title is Ahimelech and David. Let's look at the main points. First, Ahimelech gives David the bread of the presence, verses 1 through 6. Second, David receives Goliath's sword, verses 7 through 9. Third, David flees to the king of Gath, verses 10 through 15. Read verses 1 through 2. David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place.'" David escaped from Saul and went to a place called Nob. There he met Ahimelech the priest. The priest welcomed David with trembling. This was because David was an important person. There were also important incidents wherever David went. Ahimelech thought that something might happen because David was there. David then said, "The king charged me with a certain matter." David was not honest with the priest, but lied. He should have been honest. Later, Ahimelech's people would die because of David's lie. David asked the priest for bread. Verse 4. But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women." The priest said, "I don't have any ordinary bread. However, there is some consecrated bread here." The consecrated bread was the bread of the presence that was sacrificed to God. This bread was bread that was given to God. No one except the priest was allowed to eat this. David was not allowed to eat the bread because he was not a priest. However, the priest said that he would give him the bread provided the men had kept themselves from women. This meant that only those who were godly before God could eat the bread. The priest most likely asked God, chapter 22, verse 10. It was not wrong of the priest to give the consecrated bread to David, for it agreed with God's will. Matthew chapter 12, verses 3 and 4. David ate bread when his life was at risk. God told the people that no one except the priest was to eat the holy bread. The fundamental meaning behind this was that God's holy things were not to be made crude. David was a man specially used by God, and he was allowed to eat the bread. David lived a godly life, and he saved lives. Verse 7. Now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Dog the Edomite, Saul's head shepherd. There was a man named Dog the Edomite. He was Saul's head shepherd. David lied that he was going to carry out the king's order. Therefore Ahimelech listened to all of David's requests. Later, the man named Dog reported all these things to Saul. Dog reported that Ahimelech helped David. Thus Ahimelech the priest and many people died. Chapter 22, verses 11 through 19. Verse 10. That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. David was afraid of Saul and ran away to Achish, king of Gath. Achish's men kept their eyes on David. In the past, the women of Israel sang songs. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Hence Achish, the Philistine king, kept an eye on David. There was a chance that David would be killed there. David then pretended to be insane. David made marks on the doors of the gate. He let saliva run down his beard, and he pretended to be insane. King Achish then said, "He is insane. Chase him out." David was a good actor. David escaped a dangerous situation, but he was wrong in going to King Achish in the first place. David was also wrong in fearing men. David was not truthful. We must always be truthful before God. We must be truthful before people. We must not fear people. We must seek God and fear God. Our lives are not in the hands of men. God protected David so that he was not killed by King Achish. Even if David was a good actor, he would have died if God let him die. Therefore, David escaped through God's protection. David had many talents. David became the world's best musician when he was given an instrument. He became the greatest warrior when he was given a sword. He was the best shepherd. He became the best poet when he was given a pen, and he was also a great actor who would act like an insane man. David had many talents. It is good for us to have many talents. However, when we have too many talents, we will not rely on God, but rely on our talents. It will be easy for us to use our own ways and methods and not rely on God. Therefore, we believers must seek God alone with faith. Then God will protect us. Psalm chapter 34, verses 7 through 10. Here we will conclude the 8th lecture on 1 Samuel. Thank you.